Welcome to the Adorned Women podcast. Our goal is to inspire you with new stories each week featuring women of faith from all over the world and all walks of life. Through weekly discussions with each sister in Christ, we hope to give you a glimpse into who they are and how their lives have been transformed by the gospel. We're all in this journey together, so let's be inspired together. Hello, Adorned Women. Welcome back to the Adorned Women podcast. I'm your host, Alicia, and this week's guest is Alicja Wyrzykowska from Poland. And, sometimes we have periods in life that are stable and steady and peaceful, and other times there are seasons when it's not so much. It can be a little bit rougher, it can be a transition, a little unsteady. And right now, that's where Alicja is at. And so her life isn't picturesque and perfect, and neither is her relationship with God. You'll hear her share more in the interview as to why that is and what she's going through. But what I love, and what she pointed out during the conversation, is that she talks about how she knows she doesn't have to wrestle through things and win the fight, win the struggle before she comes to God. She knows that she can take that fight, take that struggle, take that wrestling to God and let Him deal with it because He has the power to do that. And He doesn't ask for us to be perfect before we come to Him. So I love that she shares that, and I love that you can see that all throughout her story today. It's really quite an amazing story. And I hope that as you listen, wherever you're at, even if you're struggling or you're wrestling and you don't feel completely right with God, that you would be encouraged and inspired to draw closer to Him, because you don't have to win the fight before you do that. God wants you where you're at, however you're feeling. And I hope that you're encouraged by today's conversation to embrace that truth and to run to Him. Hi, Alicja. Welcome to the Adorned Women podcast.
Thank you. I'm privileged to be a part of this interview, so thank you very much for the invitation.
Of course. Thank you for being willing to share some of your story and share your heart with us. I really do appreciate it. Can you start us off by sharing some context for us? Where are you living right now, and what is it like there?
Well, I'm Polish, but I just moved back to Poland after 13 years of living in Hungary, where my husband and myself, we were a part of the leadership of crew for Central and Eastern Europe. And so our organization had a big reorg, uniting the whole of Europe into one region. So we left our roles. We are still involved regionally for the whole of Europe, but not as there is no central office that used to be in Hungary. So we don't need to live there, and we just moved, and we are still unpacking. So I'm back in Warsaw, Poland, still unpacking. Haven't hung up my pictures yet. Learning how to live in my own country.
That's pretty funny. So you've been out for 13 years. In that time, you were in Hungary. So now, as you get used to Poland again, what is it like being, if you don't mind me asking, what is it like being so close to everything that's going on in Europe right now in the war and all all the tension there?
You hear Ukrainian and Russian in the streets much more than ever. There are quite a few refugees in Poland. And I think even in Hungary, when we lived in Hungary, we still lived in Hungary when the war started. So the fact that it started just across the border and the fact that, Russia had such an ambition to reunite the Soviet Union, its borders into what used to be the Soviet Union. It just caused a lot of stress, a lot of fear, how the continent will respond. So very kind of trying to find my bearings in all of that.
Right.
And burdened to pray for Ukraine, obviously. This is a huge prayer burden on my heart.
For sure. For you personally, did you experience some of that fear, or was there less of it? What were your feelings as this kind of happened?
I mean, a lot of question marks. As a believer, I don't want to fear. I want to be ready to meet my Lord and Savior. But I have children. I have grandchildren. So. And we have very close friends in Ukraine, the staff that we have worked with for many years. All these years, they were a part of our gatherings. I mentored, I coached women from Ukraine. So it feels very close. And I think because of that, it feels like something tragic is happening in my family. My husband came back from Ukraine yesterday. He decided to visit the staff in Lviv, a city in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, where a lot of people escaped to running from Eastern Ukraine that was targeted by the Russians. And so Lviv is only 70 kilometers away from the border. If you 1 mile is 1.6 kilometers, so very close to the border.
Very close, yes. Yeah, so how's that impacted your family as a whole? You said your husband was there?
Yeah, he was there just to encourage the staff, to interact with them, to find out how they're doing. He was very encouraged himself by what they are trying to do to help physically, especially soldiers and their families, but also spiritually, how to combine this practical, down-to-earth element with sharing the gospel. So. He came back safe. God has been gracious. But he has been able to see how they are functioning in this reality of war.
Wow, that's incredible to have that impact too. So you've kind of been mixed up in this a little bit. He's been going over there to encourage. What have you been spending your days doing? Are you largely right now working on transitioning and unpacking and getting settled, or do you also have any responsibilities over there?
I do have responsibilities, but right now I'm the kind of person that I want to have it off my plate. So in Hungary, we used to live in a house, and now we live in a flat, in an apartment, which is half the size of our house. So finding this kind of deciding what to throw away, what to give away, what to buy to fit, the space in a way that is very practical for us. That is taking a lot of my energy right now. I want to have it off my plate, but my role in the ministry is what is called Women's Initiatives Network, and the idea is to create a platform for women staff and volunteers from all over Europe who focus on reaching women. And so we have a group on workplace where women share different things that they are doing, so that the other women can get their ideas or can find out from whom they can learn, just kind of facilitating interaction and platforming some of the activities and ideas. So this is what I've been a part of, and helping this working group who is facilitating the whole thing move forward.
That sounds like a pretty neat role.
I'm enjoying it. I'm learning. It's very interesting for me because, even though we are one organization, Cru in Eastern Europe has functioned in a little different way than in Western Europe. So kind of getting to know each other, learning from each other, that takes time and energy, and realizing different assumptions that we all have because we come from a different context.
Right, those cross-cultural kind of clashes sometimes. Yeah, so that's a slightly different role than you were doing, is that correct?
It is it is a different role in the sense of, I used to be a part of the leadership of Central and Eastern Europe. There was a team of people who had different roles, and I was associate leader for the whole the whole area of Central and Eastern Europe. And now I am not a part of the leadership of the whole of Europe. I am a part of the leadership of this particular strategy. I'm an organizational leader, and I'm used to working in a certain way, and now I'm in a different context. So it requires. I sometimes ask myself questions. This is not my role to be the leader, but do I step up because this is not being addressed? So how do I? Kind of where are my borders? Where are my boundaries? I don't want to take away somebody's leadership from somebody else.
I'm sure that
it's
a little.
It's stretching for me.
Yeah, difficult, something new to navigate. Yeah, so. Yeah. I would like to go back now, and we can work our way back up to where you are today. Can you take me back as far back as you want to, and tell me about some of the things that have made you who you are today, some of the ways God has led you to where you are today, anything on your heart to share?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can go back to my growing up years, because I grew up in a communist Poland, and my dad was an Air Force pilot in the Communist Army. He was an atheist. He still is. He's alive. He's 92, but he hasn't left his atheistic convictions. My mom is a Roman Catholic, and growing up, later I found out that it's not so typical, but I really wanted to have a foundation for my life. And a part of it is the history of Europe, where there were 2 world wars. And a part of my Polish literature class, I read some novels and stories about people who were good people during peace, the time of peace, but then they were in a concentration camp, and to survive, they were doing things that they would have considered evil earlier. And when I was reading that, I knew deep in my heart that I don't know who I would be if I were put in such an extreme situation. And that caused me fear, and a longing to be, not to lose goodness in a situation that calls for desperate, awakes in you something that you don't know that you have. And so there was this deep desire in me to have a meaning that is beyond, material satisfaction, or even making career, or even being happy, something that would be a bigger sense, bigger meaning in life. But I didn't have a sense of God. My mom said, I asked my mom, how do you know that God exists? And she says that I feel God. And I thought, I don't feel God. So that was not convincing. And my dad was not, a person to ask those questions. So what I'm getting to is, after my first year at university, through a series of circumstances, and it would take me half an hour to describe how each thing led to another, God put me in a situation where I became an interpreter for a group of Americans who had been invited by a Polish Roman Catholic priest. And those Americans were Protestants. They were crew staff. And they were invited to share the 4 spiritual laws, the short, brief message of the gospel with young people from all over Poland. And so while I was interpreting that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and that, you are separated from God and all these different truths, and watching those Americans, I realized that this is an offer not to be rejected. And one thing that made sense for me was that they were basing their certainty about God on God's word. So they when they were asking, like when I was asking questions about why do you believe, um, they were pointing to God's word and what God is like. They were pointing to God's word. And so that kind of gave me something to hold on to. And I prayed to receive the Lord, and I just fell in love with Jesus. Jesus was the last word on my mouth when I went to bed, and the first word that when I woke up. And so that started me off on a journey of faith. And, I had ups and downs in that journey, because 1 year after I became a believer, I began to have doubts again about the existence of God. For the previous week, I had been trying to memorize some scriptures. And one thing that happened when I had those doubts and I felt so desperate and I felt like, okay, if there is no God, I'm back to point number one, And then I reached just by accident, I reached to the pile of the verses that I had on my desk and grabbed one. And I read, it was from the Gospel of John, that blessed, now that you have seen, you have believed, but blessed are those who have not seen but believed. And this was like a message from God for me. I had no idea that I had that verse in that pile. So, and it was like, a pile. It was like, wow. And so those things were very, subjective, but very special to where I was at the moment, because it felt like God was doing something, trying to communicate with me that He's there and that I'm blessed because I put my trust, not seeing, not seeing. So that was something that began to shape me as a believer. And then in my last senior year, I was challenged to come on staff. And I couldn't tell my parents that I was coming on staff. I couldn't tell anybody. It was all top secret because the communist authorities wouldn't have allowed for an international organization to function in our country. So over the years, I was a part of this organization. That communism fell and it became a legal organization, and I've been in different roles in the organization.
What a crazy story. So you grow up and you have this longing, but you don't have a lot of answers. And then God just sticks you in the middle of this group that suddenly has some answers for you, especially pointing you to the word. I loved that part of the story of not only did they speak these truths of the gospel over and over and over, but they also pointed you to the word, which was something deeper than your mom could point to with, I feel God. But then you also had that subjective side of it, like you said, where he did relate very personally to you. And it wasn't necessarily like everybody has the same experience, but you did have that very personal relationship with God that encouraged you even in your darkest times. I love that story. So you got into Cru, you said your senior year, you were invited on staff. And so from then all the way up till now, have you been on staff in this same capacity and just had your role evolve, or how did that journey go for you?
Well, the journey has had its ups and downs, and one of the downs was also a very very important moment in my relationship with God and in my involvement in Christianity. Namely, I met my husband, who was not on staff, and me as one of the leaders. because I felt that God was leading me to marry him, it was very difficult for my colleagues to see me go. And the way things were organized, we were still involved in the ministry, but now as volunteers. And obviously, it was communist times, so nobody knew the organizational ties. But I had to give up the girls that I wanted, that I had discipled, to another staff woman who was, who was focusing on the most promising disciples. So for them, it was difficult. And for me, it was very difficult because I couldn't tell them really why I had to give them up. While at the same time, I was, involved in the same place of ministry. So losing the place in the ministry, the organizational place in the ministry, woke up different carnal, different hurts in me. Some were carnal, some were probably natural because of, the way things were. But also for the staff, they didn't know how to behave. We were all peers, even the leaders were a couple of years older as believers than, the rest of us. So it was a time when I was so affected emotionally that I began to fear that the bitterness was destroying my spiritual life, and I really didn't know how to get out of it. It was very, very deep. I had those mental arguments with my colleagues, and they became so intense that, not much was needed for me to get into that argument in my head. So it lasted for quite a few years. And I wanted to forgive, and from my heart to forgive, but those arguments didn't stop. So I was desperate before the Lord that they were affecting me so totally, entirely, and I had another very special encounter with God, a God personal encounter, in the sense that at one point he said, I like to say he said, because it was not from me, why don't you start praying for them? And so I started, whenever, I cannot say that the first time I had this argument, I started to pray. I didn't have that habit, but but that habit began to form. And in 2 weeks, the arguments were gone forever. And it was like, wow, I didn't expect that. But what God did was that there was this wrestling of my emotions, my, kind of, I don't know how to describe it. I'm not a psychologist, but the spirit began to enter because of the prayer and lifting it to the Lord. I feel like God was using that channel of healing me emotionally. I saw that in that time, it ended with the healing, but in that time, I saw the darkest sides of me. And when we were challenged my husband was the first Eastern European to be challenged to take the role of leading 21 countries of Eastern Europe. And somebody asked me why I thought God was leading us to this. So one of the things that I said, and I truly believe, I saw the darkest side, or one of the darkest sides. I cannot say the darkest side, but for sure dark enough of myself. And so I cannot. I'm prepared for this role because I'm not worthy, so to speak. I cannot prove anything to anybody that I'm the hero. It has to be God. And in that was a very important period of my life, because up to until then, everything was fine. Here I was, a hero, serving the Lord in the communist Poland, making disciples, going to the dorms. All these things were just fine, and exciting. And all of a sudden, this dark time of just arguing with my friends, mental inward arguing, and seeing the dark side of me, not being able to forgive and have a clean, pure heart.
Right. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for being vulnerable with that. I think that's, even though it's not a pretty aspect of a story, it's so important, because we're all human and we all have that dark side. Like you had mentioned at the beginning with learning about the world wars and how people who are good in times of peace were suddenly pressured, and suddenly something snaps and you see that darkness come out. I think it's so interesting that kind of came full circle in that moment, and you saw a dark side of yourself, but then the Lord was able to bring you out of that. And so you did have that answered kind of desire that ultimately God was able to bring you back to good, even with still that kind of friction, that ability that you could have had to stay bitter towards them. So I really appreciate you sharing that. So as you healed from that, how long ago would you say that was?
It was, we were I was out of staff for 5 years, between 85 till 90. 90 was the year when communism fell in Poland. And my husband and I, we joined the organization already, into when it was legal. So 5 years of that struggle. It was not a short struggle.
Wow. So when you took over this new leadership role to kind of unite.
At that time, it was, we were local leaders, so it wasn't, international leadership. It was local.
Okay.
And national. Mm-hmm.
So how long ago was it that you took over this international leadership?
13 years ago, in 2009.
Okay.
About 2 years prior to that, we were already in regional roles, responsible for several countries, but not for the whole.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about that experience. You had all of this growing period, you've gotten close to the Lord, you've had to come back from this period of darkness. Now that you had grown to the point of stepping into this role, what were your responsibilities like? What was your life like? How did you feel about everything that you were doing?
Well, first of all, it was, our previous leader, Larry Thompson. He was an American whom, I admired, and I really, we were friends. So initially, I felt those were too big of shoes to step into for my husband. And it took me a while to realize that God gave him some gifts that were needed for our area at that time. And it is a lesson that I want to remember, that somebody can have excellent gifts, but the question that in different situations we need to ask is not, it's not about the person and somebody's gifting, but about the needs that are out there. That there may be specific needs that somebody else needs to fulfill with his or her specific gifting, rather than somebody who seems to have wonderful gifts anyway, but it's just a match, of the needs and the gifting. So it very quickly I saw that some of the things that God equipped my husband with is what our area needed. But one thing that was stretching for me was loving some of the countries. My parents come from the area of Poland, their families, that is not Poland anymore. Like my mom, they're Polish, but I don't know if, it might be, it's a little bit of geography and history. Poland used to be bigger on the east, so Vilnius and Lviv used to be Polish. And so my parents are from that part of Poland. So for me, it was a question mark, and I was aware of the different things of the war, like with the Soviets. So the challenge for me was, will God give me love for those countries? And God graciously did. But it was interesting because sometimes we were with the staff, and the staff were fed different propaganda than we were fed. And so hearing some of their ideas about the war and different things, it was like, uh-oh, this is not what I think about this. And yet we are we are part of a different kingdom. So learning how to deal with the present kingdom and be a part of God's, be citizens of God's kingdom. It's very, sometimes in those international relations, it is a challenge, and it is an interesting journey of stretching your heart.
Yes, that is so important, especially that distinction you made between the kingdom of heaven and our earthly kingdoms. Sometimes, while the earthly kingdoms can clash, still we all are citizens of heaven. I think that's an important point that you brought up there. So as you worked with them, I guess you had kind of developed discipling people who are local, familiar with that culture, and now you're in more of a position where you are over all of these different cultures and all these different countries. So what was some of the hardest things? You just mentioned the cultures were different, but what were some of the hardest things that you had to do with those individuals, the hardest tasks or responsibilities that you had?
Well, those 13 years have been blessed years, and I think I wouldn't, they have been very encouraging to us because we work with people who love the Lord and who were very committed, who have been committed to the gospel in their countries. So that has been my, incredible privilege. My role was to invest in women leaders in those countries. So I mentored them, I coached them, I created opportunities for them to interact with each other. To have input into the leadership and into the mission of their countries. So that has been very a wonderful privilege. I think the challenge has been to have a better understanding because like even now with Russia and the cruelty it shows and the way the Russian nation supports Putin, it all boils down to their expectations from a leader, and it's like, okay, how to be a leader that is helpful to the people that I'm leading, So with some people, you have to be more. With the leaders, you have to give them a lot of space. But even with that, there comes to all those nuances, how people see you as a leader, and what really motivates them. Coming from me, and what demotivates them. It's an interesting lesson in leadership. And so the difficult parts was how to give platform to people who are different, with different gifting, and not necessarily fit our our team, but have a gifting that needs to be platformed somehow. So finding a place for them to platform, how to platform somebody who can take, who can receive me, not receiving him into my team as a rejection. Am I making sense?
If I could see if I understand what you're saying. So the difficult part is taking those who maybe don't quite fit and giving them a platform, while at the same time they do have a little bit of distance from your team. They kind of have their own role to play. Is that correct?
Yes, and that I don't want them to feel kind of pushed away.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That is hard. So you did that for 13 years. And you still do that in a little bit different capacity?
No. What I'm doing right now is being more involved in a specific strategy. That is, the strategy is to help women staff and volunteers from all the countries of Europe to really know how they can focus their efforts better on reaching women. So this is narrower focus than my previous role was both for the whole and for women specifically. So both kind of targets. And right now, the target is the women, and there are strategies to reach women. So it's a narrower field of responsibility, but it is a challenge for me in the sense that we are working with Western Europe, which we didn't work with before. So my task for myself to feel good in this is, how do I understand Western Europe better?
Okay.
Because they have a different context, and they have different traditions of doing things. So how do I don't overbear the people there who have their responsibilities, and I have the experience of being a leader of the whole. So kind of keeping my place, but at the same time deciding, okay, when do I step in and when do I hold back?
Yeah, that sounds a little bit of a challenge there, and that also sounds like a lot of countries if it's both Eastern and Western Europe now. So It's crazy how God has moved you throughout this journey. And now, as we get back to where you started with the present day context, I would love to hear, what is your relationship with God like today, and what are some of the things He's been teaching you lately?
What is my relationship with God? Because of the war, the war brings up the topic of suffering and pain clearer than ever. That has always been a very difficult topic for me before God, that I know that He's not for evil, but He allows evil. And so throughout the centuries, there have been, terrible things happening, men doing it to other men, people doing it to other people. So I would say, I know I hold on to God as He revealed Himself, and he has been incredible in my own life. But when I hear about a believer, a father being killed while he went to get food for his family in one of the besieged Mariupol, one of the besieged cities in Ukraine. And when I hear about the cruelties, then it's very difficult for me not to wrestle with God over those. Why He is allowing that, and how long it has to last before He puts a stop on it. So that has been a major issue between me and Him in these days. Yeah.
I think that's completely understandable, and I think anybody in that position would be wrestling with God. One of the other guests I talked to, she mentioned how her faith walk is less of a walk and more of a faith wrestle. And I think that's, God invites that. He invites us to wrestle Him. And so, yeah, I can completely understand what you're saying. Now, as you've witnessed all of this pain and suffering, and it's on both believers and unbelievers alike, and you've witnessed the fear and this kind of thing, what is your perception of the state of the church in your area? Maybe where you are right now, or just kind of in the general vicinity?
Well, we are back in Poland, so we are trying to learn where to get involved and how. But from what I observe through my friends, the Polish church is quite involved in helping the refugees. All kinds of things are happening through local churches, centers for refugees. Our staff are also helping in different ways, both physically and also spiritually. And I know that similar things are happening in Hungary, but also in Moldova and Romania. The staff and the churches have responded very with a lot of sympathy and with a lot of practical help. So that has been a great testimony. And from my husband's trip, I hear that the testimony of the evangelical church in Ukraine has been very strong. Its reputation has been very strong because of its involvement in helping people. And so Ukraine, before the war, has been one of the strongest countries in Eastern Europe in terms of the evangelical population, and now with the churches rising up to this need of helping, it's becoming even better known than ever throughout the country. And Ukraine has two kinds of Orthodox church and different kinds of evangelical churches. So it has been a country of multiple Christian, denominations, and it is very encouraging for me to hear that the war has made people more aware of the evangelical church.
That is encouraging to hear that something so terrible has had as a side effect, kind of a really good effect for the church. And it's encouraging to hear too that the church is so active in helping and being the hands and feet of Jesus. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you again we're at the end of our time. So thank you again for sharing your time with me and for being willing to open up and tell your story. As I close, could you share any prayer requests that you have for your country, your family, and yourself?
Thank you. Well, can I share one life lesson because I just somehow missed it. One thing, going back to my wrestling or going back to any topic between me and God, what I discovered along the way is that I don't have to wrestle with different things by myself. I can. God knows what I'm struggling with, and He doesn't expect me to come to Him after I have won the struggle. He expects me as I am struggling, and so if I'm struggling with pride, if I'm struggling with greed or with jealousy, I can grab that monster and bring it to the Lord and have Him zap it with His light, with His Spirit. So I think that has been a very liberating discovery for me personally. And also, as I'm wrestling with pain and suffering and the evil, that also sense that I don't have to wrestle by myself. I don't have to feel that I feel guilty that I have those doubts, I have those struggles. I can bring them to the Lord, that I struggle with this, Lord. Shed some light, or just give me peace, or whatever I need, so that I can keep coming back to you, rather than walk this valley by myself.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I just have this mental image of sometimes we see this wrestle with sin as the main event, and it's like we're looking eye to eye with our enemy and we have to fight them. But in actuality, it's a much smaller scale, and you can really take that when you are covered in the blood of Christ and you are covered in His righteousness. You can take that and just bring it to God. You don't have to do the fight. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a great lesson and a great point.
Thank you. And as for the prayer request, I guess the biggest prayer request is that we would give our best to the Lord and to the mission in Europe. Europe really needs the Lord badly. So in this new, the transition of moving back to Poland, and we've been doing this role only for a few months now. So, it's still fresh, and it's still the COVID restrictions have only loosened up. So until recently, all the interactions were online. So it doesn't help building trust, and it doesn't help in communication. So for the Lord to graciously allow us to build good trust, full of relationships, full of trust with Western Europe, and for this network of women's initiatives to really grow and be envisioning and encouraging and inspiring to the women.
Certainly. We'll be praying for that. Thank you again. It's been a joy to have you on today.
Thank you, Alicia. It has been a pleasure for me as well.
Thank you for listening to the Adorned Women podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard here, then follow us on our Instagram for even more great content all week long. Our handle is @AdornedWomen. You can also visit our website at www.adornedwomen.com. And of course, join us again next week as we connect with another sister in Christ and learn so much from her life of faith. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.